Modern materialism has infiltrated the depths of the collective unconscious, building a silent but devastating empire over our ability to perceive the world authentically. When we talk about materialism, we are not just referring to the accumulation of goods, but to a lifestyle that instructs us since childhood to seek happiness and value through what we possess. Since school, we are taught to look at material success as the only measure of our worth. It is the cars we drive, the clothes we wear, the houses we live in, and the watches we wear, always more expensive, newer, more exclusive, that define us. Happiness was, little by little, being represented by these ephemeral possessions, which became synonymous with fulfillment. In my youth, everything seemed clear. Happiness was where the gold shone. I was no different than many of my generation, a product of a society that made its promises based on consumption. The self-help books, the motivational messages that circulated everywhere did nothing but reinforce this belief. With each new luxury item, a feeling of ecstasy came over me. I felt like I was reaching a higher level of satisfaction, a satisfaction that never lasted long enough. When I started working as a manager in a multinational, the game seemed even easier. The salary allowed me to buy things that previously seemed unattainable. Each payment turned into an opportunity to reinforce my identity with a new item of desire. And at that moment, I sincerely believed that this was the answer to all my dilemmas. The unbridled search for material goods was not just a way of showing off, but a constant attempt to fill an inner void, to find something that actually made sense in a world that seemed to be governed by the logic of the market. Each new purchase was not just a physical item, but a symbol of my achievement, of my success. It wasn't the good itself, but what it represented: power, status, admiration. It was as if, by showing off a new watch or an expensive outfit, I was telling myself, I am someone, I have achieved something. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of this, the feeling of fullness lasted less and less. The void began to become clearer as the euphoria of acquisitions wore off. The immediate pleasure of shopping always quickly disappeared, leaving in its place a feeling of dissatisfaction, as if something was missing. However, the biggest void of all was not the material one, but the emotional one. I began to realize very late that I was exchanging something fundamental, human relationships, for objects that, in the end, added little to what really mattered. The people around me started to disappear. The friends who used to share moments with me have moved away. They noticed the change in me before I was even able to notice it. Conversations started to revolve around what I had bought, how much I was earning, and not about what I really felt. There was no more room for them in my life. Friendships fell apart, and I found myself increasingly isolated, but without knowing why. Elisa, my companion, was one of the first to realize what was happening. She tried to warn me, always delicately, saying that she was feeling left out. However, my answer was always the same. I do this for us, to ensure a better future. But how could she understand what this future meant if it no longer included our connection, if there was no more time for her, for us? I was trapped in a vicious cycle of consumption and status, which kept me from everything that really mattered. Materialism blinded me to what was right in front of me, the relationships I was missing. It was only when I realized there was no one else by my side that the truth began to reveal itself. Elisa, already tired of the empty promises and excuses, finally walked away. And it was in that moment, in that loss, that the impact of my search for material goods became clearer than ever before. That world I had created, of shiny cars and designer clothes, was falling apart. And it was not just a consumer crisis, but an existential crisis. I found myself facing an abyss. What was really significant about me? What was left of all my effort to accumulate? The answer was nothing. I had exchanged what was eternal: love, friendship, genuine connection, for something that was ephemeral, empty. What I was left with was silence. and that silence was deafening. Materialism not only corrupts our perception of the world, but also separates us from our essence. And it was this distance that led me to deep reflection. What in fact makes us feel alive? What brings us true happiness? I, who had lived for years believing that happiness lay in what I possessed, now found myself facing gives you a cruel reality. What I had acquired did not fill the void inside me. On the contrary, he expanded it. I had left aside the simplest but also most profound things: time with the people we love, the genuine exchange of feelings, happiness in the little things. It was at that moment, when the pain of loss became stronger, that the transformation began. I knew I needed to change, but I didn't know where to start. There was something inside me that told me that the path was no longer in the insatiable search for material goods, but in something much deeper, something that I had neglected, the connection with others, and mainly with my own essence. Meanwhile, the reality around me continued to challenge me to face the truth about myself. The emptiness I felt could not be filled by one more object, one more status. I needed somehow to recover what I had lost. And this journey was just beginning. What I discovered next would transform me in ways I could never have imagined, and make me understand once and for all the true meaning of life and what truly matters. The only question now was whether I would have the courage to follow this path. As the pain of loss settled in my chest, something inside me began to stir. I knew I had reached a turning point, a moment where it would be impossible to turn back. The cycle of consumerism and emptiness that I had experienced could no longer be my reality. But the question that tormented me was, how had I gotten here? How was I able to sacrifice so much for something that ultimately didn't bring true happiness? Modern materialism, as Carl Jung pointed out, was not just about the possession of material goods. It was, in fact, a way of disconnecting the individual from their true essence, from their deepest self. The unconscious, with all its layers of desires, fears, and unspoken truths, has been expelled from the center of our consciousness. In its place, a false idol was erected: success, measured by the amount of things we accumulate. But the price of this separation from our inner truth is high, and I was beginning to pay that price now. Jung understood that modernity, with its obsession with progress and efficiency, has distanced us from the deepest questions of human existence. We have been conditioned to see our lives as a series of material achievements, each more ambitious than the last. And so, over time, things began to lose their meaning. They became just empty status symbols, and never what they were really meant to be, an expression of our authenticity. I had lost myself in the search for something that didn't exist outside of me: happiness. And in doing so, I neglected the things that could truly bring me lasting peace and satisfaction: people, love, true connection. It was only after the loss of Elisa that I began to understand how much I had neglected the relationships in my life. When she walked away from me, it wasn't just the end of a romantic relationship, but the end of a part of myself. I found myself staring into emptiness, into the reflection of a life I had built out of ego rather than heart. It was not just a painful separation, but a separation from myself. What had I done to myself? How could I be so blind as to sacrifice everything for the ephemeral shine of objects that, in the end, did not fulfill me in any way? The emptiness he felt was not just a feeling of loneliness, but a feeling of disconnection. Disconnection with the people who were once important to me, but also disconnection with myself. I had put all my energy into building a facade, an image of success that actually masked a deep emptiness inside. The real loss was not in the things I had or had lost, but in the loss of who I really was. I asked myself, who am I when objects and status no longer define who I am? The answer didn't come easily, but it began to emerge little by little as I allowed myself to look inside. I began to revisit the memories, the sensations that had been archived in the depths of my mind. When I think about the times I felt truly happy, I realized that it wasn't the objects that gave me that feeling, but the simple moments I shared with the people I loved. When I was with Elisa, in the moments when we disconnected from the world and just talked, listened to music, laughed together. When I shared a meal with friends, without worrying about showing how much I had or what I owned. It was in this space of authenticity and connection that I felt life made sense. However, I was so seduced by the idea that happiness was in material things that I let these experiences slip away without realizing it. Human connection, on the contrary river of material goods, never wears out in the same way. It does not depend on consumer trends or the ephemerality of fashions. True friendships don't require luxury cars or expensive clothes to stay alive. And that's what I started to realize more clearly. What really matters are the genuine connections we have with others. Life is made up of these moments, these gestures of affection and understanding, which are often invisible to the eyes that only seek what can be purchased. I was watching my life pass by, and the only thing I had truly achieved were material possessions that now seemed, to me, like pieces of a world that I no longer wanted to inhabit. However, something inside me knew that this void would not be filled with more consumption. Something deeper was needed, something I had ignored for a long time. The idea of a new path began to germinate in my mind. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I was willing to embark on a journey of self-discovery and reconnection. To do this, I knew I would need to abandon the incessant search for more material goods and look inside courageously to find what I had lost, my true essence. I started to reevaluate my relationship with the world. It was no longer objects that should define my happiness, but the way I related to others and to myself. The first attempt at change was more subtle. I started paying more attention to the people around me. Professional life, which had always been my priority, began to lose its relevance. I knew that without people by my side, without a support network, and without a deeper meaning in life, I was nothing more than an empty shell, accumulating more and more things to try to fill a hole that only grew. Of course, this transformation was not simple at first. Materialism had become deeply rooted in my mind, and the temptation to return to the old way of life was ever present. In the early days, I still found myself thinking about the things I could buy, the irresistible promotions, the victories that could be represented by new goods. But something was starting to change. I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. Objects began to lose the meaning they once had. Instead of worrying about showing off my success, I started to care more about real conversations, about the time I spent with those who really mattered. In this process, I realized that what really made sense was to reconnect with the simple but essential things. The time dedicated to others, the affection in words, the attentive look at those around me. I began to understand that what I had been looking for so long was not in luxury stores or shopping centers. It was in the small gestures, in the sincere conversations, in the moments of shared silence. And as this transformation unfolded, a new question arose in my mind. How can I regain my own life and free myself from this prison of materialism that until that moment I had considered the only way to be happy? This answer was closer than I imagined, but it would require courage to finally let go of what was holding me back. And the next stage of this journey was quickly approaching. A stage that would lead me to discover not only who I really was, but also what it meant to live truly fully. When I began to distance myself from the incessant pursuit of material goods, a new and strange feeling began to arise within me, what I felt before as a lack of something, as if the emptiness inside was a hole that couldn't be filled, now turned into an opening, an empty space, but of a different nature. It was as if, when I finally stopped consuming non-stop, I started to create space for something new, something more genuine, something I didn't know existed inside me. Jung believed that throughout our lives, we go through a process called individuation. This process is a journey of self-knowledge where we confront our deep and true self, When we abandon the masks we use to adapt to external demands, we begin to get in touch with who we really are. For me, abandoning materialism was the first step towards this discovery. It seemed contradictory, but I had to lose everything I thought defined me: success at work, status, possessions, in order to rediscover something that was buried beneath years of superficiality, my own being. I clearly remember one morning, sitting alone in a park, with the distant sound of children playing in the background and the soft light of the sun illuminating everything around me. It was a feeling of calm and clarity, as if the world around me was shedding its heavier layers, and I could finally see things as they really were. They were. What I was looking for was there, but it wasn't something to be acquired. It was something to be experienced. Something to be experienced in the simple act of being present, of breathing, of listening to birdsong or the sound of leaves moving in the wind. This moment of introspection led me to reflect on what really gave meaning to my life. What I now realized was that although materialism had provided me with moments of pleasure, those moments were always fleeting and unsustainable. I needed something more, something that would last. True satisfaction was not in possessing more things, but in being more present in human relationships, in those moments when we open ourselves completely to each other, where time seems to stop, and all that exists is the genuine connection between two souls. It was at that point that I realized that human relationships were what I was most lacking. It wasn't the things, but the people, the interactions, the emotions we exchanged. Elisa, with whom I had lost connection, represented everything I had ignored for so long. It wasn't just love we shared, but friendship, companionship, empathy, mutual support. And upon realizing this, I realized that I could not continue my journey without at least trying to recover those relationships that I had destroyed in the name of a false ideal of success. But there was something in me, a resistance, a deep fear of being rejected, of being seen as someone incapable of changing. What I didn't know was that true change begins with recognizing our flaws and limitations. We can't change what we don't recognize, and I was finally starting to recognize my flaws. I had prioritized consumption and the image of success so much that, over the years, I stopped giving value to what really mattered, the people around me. They were there, always by my side, but I didn't see them. And when I finally saw them, it was too late for Elisa, who had already moved on. The pain of this loss hit me in a way I didn't expect. I felt like I had lost the only thing that really mattered, but at the same time, this pain turned into an awakening. That's when I realized that the pain, although immense, was also an opportunity. She forced me to face the truth, to no longer run away from myself. And it was from that point that I began to look for redemption, not in objects or in the accumulation of possessions, but in an attempt to reconnect with what was lost. It wasn't just about Elisa, but about love, friendship, and mutual respect. I needed to reconnect with what really made life worth living. This move was not easy. It was no longer enough to look at the things around me and think that they would resolve the emptiness. I had to look inside. It was as if, by clearing away the surface layer of my life, I was unearthing something much deeper. Something that had always been there, but that I hadn't known how to see before. The journey of reconciliation with my true essence was just beginning. I knew that true happiness wouldn't come from a new watch, a trip to an exotic destination, or a fuller bank account. It would come from my ability to be authentic, to allow myself to live with what really mattered. But the transformation process was far from immediate. The temptation to return to the comfort zone was great. The work routine, the pleasure of shopping, the feeling of power that consumption gave me were like a drug, always ready to seduce me again. However, with each day that passed, with each small gesture of reconnection with people I truly valued, I realized that this void was beginning to be filled. The hole was no longer filled with material goods, but with moments and emotions. A phone call to a distant friend, a sincere conversation with a family member, a spontaneous smile shared with a stranger. Each of these gestures began to give me what I was looking for, a sense of belonging, of meaning, of authenticity. Meanwhile, my journey also led me to look at what I had left behind. It wasn't just about winning Elisa back, but about understanding the value of all the people who were part of my life. I began to reconcile with the friends I had left behind, with the family I had neglected in the name of work and consumption. And even if it wasn't possible to go back and correct everything that had been lost, there was something in me that knew that reconstruction was possible. And so, little by little, I began to realize that it wasn't too late. But at the same time, what I was beginning to understand was that the process of reconciliation and growth did not happen in a linear way. There were ups and downs, moments of great clarity and others of great doubt. What I knew, however, was that I could no longer go back to my old life. The old me, the one who worried about accumulating and showing off, was gone. I was getting in touch with a new me, a me more connected to what really mattered. The journey was just beginning, and I knew it would take me somewhere I had never imagined before. But the most important thing was that this change was starting to happen, and with it came a new hope. Perhaps after everything, I would finally be able to live in a fuller, more authentic and truer way. A life where happiness was not defined by how much I had, but by who I was. Time passed, and as I continued on this journey of self-discovery, I realized that true transformation did not just occur in small daily actions, but in a profound change in the way I saw the world. The emptiness I felt, the one I had previously tried to fill with objects and status, was beginning to be filled by something more substantial, the meaning of life. And it was at this point that I finally began to understand what Jung meant by the search for meaning. What he teaches us is that true happiness is not in an endless search for immediate pleasure, but in a continuous process of understanding what really gives us meaning, what makes us feel alive. Before, my vision of happiness was tied to consumption, the new, the shine of a watch, or the feeling of power that came with buying a luxury car. I believed that by purchasing the next great item, I would finally achieve a lasting state of satisfaction. But the reality was very different. With each new purchase, satisfaction was ephemeral, like a flash in the pan that soon went out, leaving me once again with the emptiness I felt before. The deeper I sank into this cycle of consumerism, the more the inner emptiness deepened until it became a constant, distressing presence. It was only when I stopped looking for happiness in external things that I began to realize the true purpose of life. Human connections. I was finally beginning to understand that relationships are the true source of meaning. And that was a tough lesson, because while this realization brought me a sense of relief, it also confronted me with the irreparable damage that my obsession with materialism had caused. The people I loved most were distant, pushed away by my egocentrism, by my inability to understand their emotional needs, by my blindness to what really mattered. Elisa was no longer by my side, and the worst thing of all was that I only realized how essential she was to my life when I lost her. And when I realized it, the pain of loss was a constant reminder of what I had ignored for years. The search for meaning is not an easy road. It is not a path that leads us directly to the answer, but a continuous process of searching and learning. For me, this path became full of small victories, but also of frustrations and questions. I started getting involved in activities that previously seemed pointless or insignificant to me, like volunteering. At first, I thought this was a way to fill the void, a way to do good for others, and perhaps to redeem myself for all that I had neglected. But I soon realized that more than helping others, volunteering helped me reconnect with myself, with what I truly believed. It allowed me to realize the impact that human actions can have, not in material terms, but in emotional and spiritual terms. True gratification, I realized, was in what we couldn't see but had always been there. the genuine change that occurs when we offer our time, our attention, and our heart to others. As I made these new discoveries, a sense of peace began to wash over me. Not a superficial peace like the one I felt after purchasing a new item, but a deep peace which came from within. I learned that true happiness does not depend on what we possess, but on what we are able to give to others. The simple act of listening to someone, of being present without judgment, without rushing to chase something else, has become one of the greatest sources of joy for me. I no longer needed to buy a new piece of clothing or a new gadget to feel good. I needed to be present, both with myself and with others. This shift in perspective also led me to reconsider my outlook on work. For years, he'd been obsessed with professional success, with career growth, with the image he projected to the world. Work, before, was a means to accumulate status, power, and material goods. But now, I started to see work in a different way. I was more focused on how I could use my skills to contribute to the greater good, how I could positively impact the lives of those around me. It was no longer about getting promoted or having the biggest bank account. It was about doing work that had meaning, that was aligned with my values, and that allowed me to grow personally and professionally in a more authentic way. The process of coming to terms with my own failings also involved a series of difficult decisions. It wasn't just about winning back the friends he had lost or trying to repair his relationship with Elisa. It was about looking at my own behavior and making peace with myself, realizing that I'm not perfect, that I made mistakes, and that, no matter how painful it was, I needed to learn to forgive myself. Self-compassion, which previously seemed like a distant concept, became something increasingly present in my life. And it was in this process of acceptance that I began to feel like I could finally stop defining myself by my past mistakes and look to the future with hope. But not everything was easy. In many moments, the old pattern of consumerism and the temptation to return to the superficial life of before appeared. I was tempted to seek comfort in things, to fall back into the trap of instant gratification. But now, I knew these moments weren't the solution, just a temporary distraction. I was beginning to understand that true wealth is not in the quantity of things we own, but in the quality of what we give and receive from the people around us. True happiness is not in the incessant search for more, but in the ability to fully live what we already have, in the relationships we cultivate, and in the peace we find within ourselves. This journey, although full of ups and downs, led me to a crucial discovery. The meaning of life is not in the things we buy, nor in the external achievements we seek. It lies in what we are capable of cultivating within ourselves, in the ability to give love, to share, to be true and authentic. And this is what Jung meant when he said that true wealth is in what cannot be bought. I didn't need more things anymore. I needed more people, more love, more genuine connections. And now I knew there was no going back. My life, once empty and superficial, was beginning to fill with purpose. I was finally starting to live a full life, and that was just the beginning. The weight of Jung's words resonated in my mind as I tried to process the magnitude of what was happening inside me. The unconscious, that vast and mysterious reservoir of our repressed emotions, thoughts, and experiences, seemed to be slowly emerging from the shadow in which I had left it. For years it had been like a dammed river, its waters hidden and contained, waiting, just waiting to be released. And when that happened, I realized that the only way to understand the depth of my transformation was to explore this unconscious in a more conscious way. It was no longer about being at the mercy of superficial impulses, but about embracing who I really was, with all my flaws, my pains, and my shadows. Jung's concept of the unconscious was not just theoretical to me now, it was becoming real, tangible, and I was beginning to see its strength in the way my attitudes, thoughts, and even my feelings were rearranging themselves. The unconscious, contrary to what many think, is not something isolated, distant from us. He is in every look we exchange, in every feeling we deny, in every impulse we have, and often we don't understand. It is the inner voice that tells us, between the lines, what we need, even if our conscious mind refuses to listen. And throughout this process of self-analysis, I began to understand that the materialism that dominated my life was, in a way, a defense against my unconscious, a mechanism to keep everything under control, to avoid confrontations with the parts of myself that were not I wanted to face it. As I reflected on this, I remembered how the search for objects had become, for me, a substitute for the search for meaning. Every time I felt empty or anxious, I went after something new. And once again, like a vicious cycle, the satisfaction was never lasting. The emptiness returned with more force, and I didn't know how to deal with it. What Jung teaches us is that these defense mechanisms, these unconscious strategies that we create to deal with life's stresses are often harmful. What seemed like an immediate relief turned over time into an invisible prison, a structure that limits us from perceiving and exploring our true needs, our real emotions, and our authenticity. It was at this point that I began to confront my relationship with consumption and materialism head-on. This confrontation was not easy. Every item I purchased that seemed to fill the void for a short period of time was, in reality, a reflection of my attempt to fill the void within with something external, and that only took me away from myself. The real work began when I realized I was seeking something beyond what the material world could offer. I was, in fact, searching for my true identity, my own soul, and what was truly valuable to me. And this could not be found in objects, nor on social media, nor in the false images I created to feel accepted or admired by others. It was a long and painful process. It wasn't just about giving up consumption or material goods. It was actually about letting go of a part of myself that I had projected, about dismantling an identity that was centered on having rather than being. But the unconscious, as Jung teaches us, does not disappear just because we ignore it. It manifests itself in unexpected and often painful ways until it decides it's time to be true to ourselves. He demands that we face what is hidden, that we face our shadows. This process of reconciliation with the unconscious also involved confronting my own insecurities. With each step I took towards self-knowledge, new layers of myself emerged, and some of those layers were difficult to deal with. Feelings of inadequacy, of fear of not being enough, of not being worthy of love, began to emerge with a clarity that I had previously tried to block out. Materialism had been, for me, a way of masking these feelings, of camouflaging my vulnerabilities with objects and status. But deep down, these vulnerabilities were still there, waiting to be seen and understood. It was then that the real therapy began, facing my shadows, understanding my own fragility, and at the same time, recognizing that this did not make me any less worthy of love and happiness. Working with the unconscious also led me to reflect on time. I had wasted so much time chasing after things that weren't essential, that weren't truly mine, that didn't represent my true essence. During all those years that I invested in materialism, in appearance, I had lost the most precious moments of my life. Time with the people I loved, time for myself, to reflect, to grow. Now, with this new perspective, I began to value time differently. Every moment, every small gesture of affection or attention started to have immense meaning. Time could no longer be wasted, neither on empty things nor on anxieties that took me away from the present. Jung says that by reconnecting with our unconscious, with who we really are, we reach a deeper level of authenticity. And that, as difficult as it was, proved to be the key to true freedom. Freeing oneself from the shackles of materialism, from everything that had been built based on external and superficial expectations, was like a liberation of the soul. It was like finally breathing fresh air after years of suffocation. I was no longer a mask. I was no longer the image I built to please others. I was finally myself, with all my imperfections, but also with all my potential. As the unconscious took shape in my life, I began to see things differently. What previously seemed like an obstacle, like the difficulties in my relationship with Elisa or the separation from my friends, began to be understood as part of a necessary process. The unconscious does not hold grudges. It does not hold revenge. It just shows us what we need to learn. And that's when I started to see the lessons in difficult times, in losses, in difficulties. Each challenge was an opportunity for growth, a chance to get closer to who I really am. This process of reconciliation with the unconscious also led me to reconsider the way I saw myself in the world. It was no longer about being successful in the eyes of others, but about being someone who, at the end of each day, could look in the mirror and say, "I lived in my truth." And that, I realized, was what really mattered. As I explored this inner dimension more deeply, I began to notice how the old ways of thinking and acting were disappearing, being replaced by a new perspective. And I knew this journey had no end. It was a way of continuous self-knowledge, a journey that would take me even deeper, but at least now I was aware that I was on the right path. Awakening to true consciousness is one of the most transformative moments in the human journey. When Jung talks about the importance of becoming aware of the parts of ourselves that remain at the margins of our awareness, he is not just challenging us to understand more about who we are. He invites us to question the entire structure upon which we have built our lives. Consciousness, as he suggests, is not just about being more awake to what is around us, but also about recognizing that which is hidden within us, waiting to be revealed. This new insight into consciousness began to form within me as I reflected on the way my life had been lived up to that point. Until then, I had been guided by superficial impulses, immediate needs, and external expectations. The pursuit of consumption, success, and status were just symptoms of something deeper, a lack of true connection with my inner being. And while life seemed to unfold in a succession of ephemeral moments, I felt more lost with each material achievement. But when I began to delve into the search for true consciousness, everything changed. Consciousness was not just about acquiring knowledge or being more attentive to the world. It was, in fact, a radical process of detachment, of letting go of what is superficial and building a new way of understanding oneself. When Jung talks about individuation, he describes this process as a journey that takes us to become our most authentic self, the part of us that is in harmony with our deepest essence, without the masks we construct to please others. The path of consciousness is not linear. It is full of ups and downs, moments of clarity and periods of doubt. I felt it with every step, every day, that I tried to reconnect with what really mattered. The first challenge was recognizing that in order to awaken awareness, I needed to stop acting as if I were just reacting to the external circumstances of life. I needed to stop chasing a future that wasn't mine, looking for validation in things that didn't bring real happiness. I needed to look inside, pay attention to my emotions, my mind, and above all, the way I saw the world and what really made sense. As I cultivated this awareness, I realized how absent it was in my life before. Consciousness is not limited to understanding oneself, but extends to the world around us. I began to see things more deeply, no longer just as objects to be acquired or moments to be conquered, but as experiences that could teach me something more lasting than any material possession. I started paying more attention to little things, to everyday interactions that previously went unnoticed. A simple smile, the sound of rain hitting the window, silence shared with a friend. These things began to take on meaning that I had never realized before. Everyday life, which I had always considered monotonous, became an inexhaustible source of learning. This new awareness challenged me to look at my relationships with a new perspective. The truth is that I had always known, deep down, that material things could not replace the depth of human relationships. But for years, I had deluded myself, putting other people second while prioritizing my external achievements. Now I saw others not as a means to an end, but as complex human beings with their own stories, needs, and pains. And it was in this space of true connection that I found true purpose. I remembered a conversation I had with Elisa shortly after we started to rebuild our relationship. She told me something that stuck in my mind. You don't realize, but it was when you started to see me for who I am and not for who you wanted me to be, that our relationship began to change. This, in fact, concerned a fundamental principle of consciousness. We can only truly connect with others when we are willing to see what is beyond our own projections, when we are able to look at others without the filters we create to justify our needs or fears. That was when I began to understand, in depth, the meaning of presence. Being present with someone doesn't just mean being physically there, but being emotionally and spiritually available for the shared experience. True awareness involves stopping doing everything automatically, without reflection. Life cannot be lived on autopilot. We need to be aware of how we are reacting, what we are feeling, and more important, why we are doing what we do. This awareness process also led me into a field that I had previously ignored: self-compassion. For a long time, my relationship with myself was marked by constant demands, the incessant search for external approval, and a deep fear of being seen as weak or vulnerable. But true awareness implies, first of all, accepting ourselves in our imperfections. This was freeing, because when I accepted that I was human, with all my flaws, I could finally start to forgive myself. I learned that there is no room for true growth without forgiving yourself, without accepting that the journey of self-knowledge is made up of ups and downs, and that each mistake carries with it a precious lesson. It was at that moment that I realized how much I had neglected silence, how much the constant noise of my activities, my work, my ambitions took me away from what really mattered. Silence, contrary to what I thought, was not something to be avoided or filled with new distractions. Silence was a sacred space, a fertile ground where the seeds of true consciousness could grow. I began to seek this silence every day, whether on solitary walks or in simple moments of reflection before bed. It was there, in the silence, that I found the answers that my spirit was looking for, answers that the frenzy of the modern world could never offer me. Now, as I sought to reconnect with what really mattered, my view of the world and myself was transforming. Each step toward awareness was a step toward a more authentic version of myself, a step toward a me that was freer, more at peace, and more in tune with what life really had to offer. But, as Jung wisely teaches, this is just the beginning. True freedom, true inner peace, is only possible when we can understand the depths of our own psyche and make it our ally. And the most fascinating thing about all of this is that as we advance along this path, we find a life that is much richer and truer than any material good could provide us. And this journey, although challenging, is the only one that is truly worth living. Deep down, I knew there was still a lot to discover, a lot to transform. And as the path of consciousness continued before me, with its lessons and revelations, I felt a new energy taking hold of my soul, as if the world was finally within my reach, ready to be explored in a deeper and more meaningful way. Finding meaning in life is, without a doubt, one of the most universal and profound searches we can undertake. Carl Jung believed that to live a fulfilled life, we need to be able to look beyond the immediate demands of society and connect with a greater purpose. The search for meaning is not a simple task, nor is it a goal that is easily achieved. It is, in fact, an internal journey, a process that requires courage to confront our insecurities and discover what really moves us. Before I began my own search for meaning, I lived a pretty mechanical life. Each day unfolded in the same way. I woke up, went to work, bought what I felt I needed, and at the end of the day, returned home, feeling like I had made more effort to achieve something, but without really knowing what. The work, the material goods, and the successes achieved had given me a momentary feeling of satisfaction, but it never lasted. They didn't fill the void I felt inside me. Life, although apparently full, was, in fact, superficial. I felt lost. What was missing were not things, but a true meaning to my existence. It was from this feeling of emptiness that I began to question the real value of everything I had achieved. I knew something deeper was missing, but what? What would really make me feel like my life had meaning, that my time wasn't being wasted? At that point, I realized that the answer lay not in material possessions or the expectations of success that society imposed, but rather in the authentic experiences and relationships that I had neglected. The idea of meaning for me transformed from the moment I started looking at things with a more conscious and attentive look. The search for meaning is not about a grand event, something that must be found in a great moment of revelation or success. No, meaning is, first and foremost, a process of creation. And this creation does not occur in great moments of external achievements, but in the small choices we make every day. Meaning is in the genuine conversations we have, in the hours dedicated to someone without expecting anything in return, in the moments of silence we dedicate to reflecting on who we are and what we are, and we really want it for our lives. I remember when I first started making small changes to my routine. I used to think that work was the only way to find purpose, but then I realized that the meaning was in how I did that work, in the interactions with colleagues, in the way I related to others, in the intention with which I carried out my tasks, daily tasks. I began to ask myself, what do I do with the time I have? Am I doing this with intention and purpose, or am I just reacting to the need to fulfill an obligation? This reflection was transformative because it led me to see work not as a prison, but as an opportunity to express who I am, to bring something of value to the world, even if it was in a discreet way. The meaning has also become more evident in my personal relationships. I realized that for a long time, I had been so focused on my career and my material achievements that I neglected those who mattered most to me. Elisa, who had been a constant presence in my life, began to withdraw. His gestures, once small, began to lose importance to me. And when I finally woke up to this, I realized that I could no longer continue to live as if my life was just about what I owned or the appearances I showed to the world. I wanted more. I wanted genuine connections, moments of true complicity, relationships that challenged and enriched me in a way that consumption could never do. The true journey in search of meaning is not about finding something that is already there waiting for us. It's about creating something new in our lives based on the way we connect with others, with ourselves, and with the world. This required me to let go of the idea that happiness comes from outside, from buying something new or from external approval, and start looking for happiness in the choices I made, in the people I interacted with, in the impact I had on the world. This idea that meaning lies in creating a purposeful life was reinforced by something I read in a book by Viktor Frankl, In Search of Meaning. Frankl, a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps, wrote that even in the most extreme conditions, the search for meaning is what keeps people alive. It was not the search for pleasure or success that motivated them, but the search for a greater purpose, something that transcended adversity. He showed that even in the darkest moments, if we have a clear meaning for our lives, we are capable of overcoming the greatest challenges. I realized that to find meaning, I needed to look at my suffering and mistakes not as burdens, but as opportunities for growth and learning. As I delved deeper into this new outlook on life, I began to engage in activities that had previously seemed irrelevant to me. Volunteering, for example, was something that began to fill the gap I felt within myself. Helping other people, without expecting anything in return, gave me an immense sense of purpose. When I started dedicating a few hours a week to causes that really mattered, I could see clearly how meaning lies not in acquiring or achieving, but in giving, in serving others, in being part of something bigger than myself. I realized that life gains more value when we share our energy with others, whether with words, gestures, or simply being present. Additionally, I began to reconnect with activities that I previously considered lost, such as walking in nature, reflecting on my life, reading books that challenged my worldview. These simple but profound things began to bring a sense of purpose that the accumulation of material goods could never offer me. The search for meaning was no longer something to be achieved quickly, but something to be cultivated with patience and dedication. Each step, each reflection brought me closer to a genuine and authentic life. Today, looking back, I see that meaning is not in finding a great purpose, but in living with the intention of adding value to the world and the people around me. This is the greatest teaching that life has given me so far. Meaning is something we build every day based on our actions, our choices, the way we relate to others. And it is this journey that allows us to transcend the limitations imposed by society, find true happiness, and ultimately live a life full of purpose. And as Jung pointed out, it is only when we surrender to this journey of internal search that we are able to live fully in harmony with ourselves and the world. And true freedom, this state of plenitude, comes when we learn to reconnect with what really matters. Reconnecting with the self is one of the most powerful and at the same time most challenging processes we can experience. When we end up in a routine of incessant search for status and material things, we forget who we really are. We let external expectations define our value and distance ourselves from our essence. This emptiness, which many of us feel at some point, can only be filled by returning to ourselves, to our inner truth. For years, I identified with the things I owned, with the titles society gave me. I was the successful executive, the successful man, the one who had the luxury car and the expensive watch. But over time, I realized that these things didn't reflect who I really was. They represented an image built based on other people's expectations, not on who I really was. And this distance from myself created an emptiness, a discomfort that bothered me. It was only when the crisis hit, the loss of something I truly valued, like the relationships I had neglected, that I realized the urgent need to reconnect with my deepest self. I started to question, what really matters to me? Who am I without all these things and labels? And it was at that moment that I began to understand that true peace and happiness could only be found when I looked inside, at my essence, without the masks that the world had imposed. The journey of reconnecting with self was not easy. It required reflection, self-compassion, and most importantly, the courage to look within, without fear of facing the deepest truths. I started practicing introspection, asking myself hard questions every day. Am I living according to my deepest values? Am I being true to myself? With each answer, I got closer to the person I always was, but who was lost beneath the layers of superficiality and external expectations. Self-care in this process was not limited to taking care of the body, but began to include the mind and spirit. I learned to respect my limits, listen to my emotions, and make space for silence. It was in this space that I found my true voice, the one that was previously drowned out by the noise of the world. This silence allowed me to realize that true value is not in things, but in who we are and the impact we have on the lives of the people who really matter to us. Jung said that true freedom comes from self-knowledge, from being able to free ourselves from external expectations and the illusions that imprison us. This path of reconnection with the self is not something that happens overnight. It requires courage, patience, and above all, the willingness to let go of the ideas and material goods that we believed were essential to our happiness. Today, I understand that true happiness is not in what we have, but in who we are, how we relate to others, and how we feel in our own skin. By reconnecting with myself, I found a deeper meaning to life. It's not about having more, but about being more authentic, more present, more connected to what really matters. And this is the freedom that we can all achieve. Just look inside and follow the path of self-discovery.